The flashing red and blue lights painted a macabre dance across the rain-slicked asphalt of the deserted county road. For Deputy Alex Thorne, it was a familiar ballet, one he had witnessed countless times over his decorated 15-year career with the Oak Haven Sheriff's Department. But tonight, the rhythmic pulse of the lights felt like a hammer against his skull, each beat a mocking echo of the frantic thumping in his own chest. He stood over the body of his partner, Mark Corrigan, the man he had shared a patrol car with for the last 3 years, and felt the chilling emptiness of a line crossed, a vow shattered. The world had irrevocably tilted on its axis, and Alex knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his life as he knew it was over. What led a respected lawman, a pillar of his community, to murder his own partner? What secrets lay buried so deep that they were worth killing for? To uncover the shocking truth behind a hero's downfall and the dark secrets that fester behind the badge, subscribe now to continue reading. Chapter 1. The weight of a secret. The Oak Haven County Sheriff's Department was housed in a stoic, 2-story brick building that had stood since the late 1950s. It smelled of stale coffee, industrial-strength cleaner, and the faint, ever-present scent of anxiety. For Deputy Alex Thorne, it was a second home. At 42, he moved with the easy confidence of a man who knew his place in the world. His uniform was always impeccably pressed. His boots shined to a mirror finish, and his presence commanded a natural respect from rookies and veterans alike. Alex was the kind of cop everyone looked up to. Calm in a crisis, decisive, and possessing an uncanny intuition that had closed more cases than most detectives. He was a department hero, the man whose picture was on the recruitment brochures, the steady hand you wanted by your side when things went sideways. His partner, Deputy Mark Corrigan, was a different breed of lawman. 10 years younger than Alex, Mark was an idealist, fueled by a black-and-white view of justice that left little room for the shades of gray Alex had come to navigate. Where Alex was pragmatic, Mark was a stickler for the rules. Where Alex saw the big picture, Mark focused on the letter of the law. This fundamental difference had created a persistent, low-grade friction in their partnership. It wasn't open hostility, but rather a constant, unspoken debate over procedure and protocol. Mark would meticulously log every piece of evidence, write reports that were novelistic in their detail, and refuse to cut even the smallest corner. Alex, on the other hand, believed that sometimes the spirit of the law was more important than its rigid application. He had a knack for de-escalating situations with a well-placed word or a shared cigarette, methods that often left Mark shaking his head in disapproval. "You can't just let a guy go with a warning for shoplifting, Alex," Mark would argue after Alex had sent a terrified teenager home with a stern lecture instead of a criminal record for stealing a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter. "It sets a bad precedent." "The kid was hungry, Mark, not a hardened criminal," Alex would reply, his voice calm and even. "Putting him in the system for that isn't justice. It's just creating another problem down the road." Their dynamic was a constant push and pull, a balancing act that, for the most part, worked. Alex's experience tempered Mark's zeal, and Mark's by-the-book approach kept Alex from straying too far from the line. But beneath the surface of their professional disagreements, something else was brewing, something that only Alex was aware of. It was a secret he carried like a lead weight in his gut, a ghost from a past he had worked tirelessly to bury. 15 years ago, before he was a respected deputy in Oak Haven, Alex had been a rookie cop in a sprawling, corruption-riddled city department 3 states away. He had been young, ambitious, and naive, eager to make a name for himself. He fell in with a group of older, more experienced officers, a tight-knit unit that prided itself on getting results, no matter the cost. They were revered within the department, but their methods were dirty. They planted evidence, coerced confessions, and operated under their own brand of street justice. For a while, Alex was swept up in the adrenaline and the camaraderie. He looked the other way, told himself it was for the greater good. But one night it all went too far. A drug bust went bad, and an unarmed informant ended up dead. It was an accident, a tragic mistake in a chaotic situation, but the unit, led by a charismatic but ruthless detective named Marcus Thorne, Alex's older brother, covered it up. They staged the scene, planted a weapon on the informant, and created a story of self-defense that was airtight. Alex had been the one to plant the gun. The weight of that decision had haunted him ever since. He left the department shortly after, unable to live with the lie and the constant fear of exposure. He changed his name, moved to a small town where no one knew him, and reinvented himself as the model lawman he had once aspired to be. He had built a new life in Oakhaven, a life of honor and integrity that was a direct penance for the sins of his past. He had a wife, 2 kids, and the respect of an entire community. He had almost convinced himself that the man who had planted that gun was gone forever. The past, however, has a way of refusing to stay buried. It began with something small, a detail in a case that should have been routine. Alex and Mark were called to a local pawn shop to investigate a break-in. The owner, a nervous man named Sal, reported that a safe had been stolen. The safe, he claimed, contained mostly paperwork and a small amount of cash. But as Mark was taking Sal's statement, Alex noticed something odd. In the back office, amidst the shattered glass and overturned furniture, was a small, framed photograph on the wall, partially obscured by a fallen filing cabinet. It was a picture of a younger Sal, grinning alongside another man. Alex's blood ran cold. The other man was Marcus Thorne. Alex quickly tried to steer the investigation away from Sal's personal life, dismissing the break-in as a simple smash and grab. "Probably some local junkies looking for a quick score," he said, his voice a little too casual. "They took the safe, they'll crowbar it open, find nothing but paper, and dump it in the river. We'll probably find it in a week or 2. But Mark, with his meticulous attention to detail, wasn't so quick to dismiss it. He noticed the precision of the break-in. The alarm system had been expertly bypassed, and the thieves had ignored more valuable items in the front of the shop, heading straight for the back office. "This wasn't random, Alex," Mark insisted later as they sat in their patrol car, the smell of stale coffee filling the small space. "They knew what they were looking for. I think Sal is hiding something." Over the next few days, Mark became obsessed with the pawn shop case. He ran a deep background check on Sal, something Alex had conveniently overlooked. He discovered that Sal had a criminal record, a string of minor offenses that all led back to the same city Alex had fled 15 years ago. Mark started digging into Sal's old associates, cross-referencing names and dates. He was a dog with a bone, and every new piece of information he uncovered brought him one step closer to Alex's carefully constructed lie. Alex grew increasingly desperate. He tried everything he could to throw Mark off the scent. He lost files, mislabeled evidence, and fed Mark false leads that sent him on wild goose chases. But Mark was relentless. He saw the inconsistencies, the small but growing number of irregularities in Alex's handling of the case. For the first time in their partnership, Mark started to look at Alex with suspicion. "Why are you pushing back so hard on this, Alex?" Mark finally confronted him one afternoon in the department parking lot. "It's like you don't want me to solve this case. It's a dead end, Mark," Alex said, his voice tight with a frustration that was only partially feigned. "You're wasting department resources on a low-level BNE. We have bigger fish to fry. Or maybe you know more about this than you're letting on," Mark countered, his eyes narrowing. The accusation hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. The breaking point came a week later. Mark, working late into the night, had managed to track down a name from Sal's past, a name that connected Sal to a notorious unit of dirty cops from Alex's old department. And with that name, he found a grainy, black-and-white photograph from an old newspaper article. It was a picture of the unit celebrating a major drug bust. Standing in the back, younger and with more hair but unmistakably him, was a young officer named Alex Thorne. Mark stared at the picture, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with a horrifying clarity. He finally understood Alex's strange behavior, his resistance, his desperation to shut down the investigation. His partner, the man he had trusted with his life, was not who he said he was. Mark didn't confront Alex immediately. He was a cop, and his instinct was to gather evidence to build an airtight case. He printed the photo and the article and placed them in a sealed evidence bag. He knew he had to go to internal affairs, but he also knew the implications of his discovery. Accusing a decorated officer like Alex Thorne would send shockwaves through the department. He needed to be absolutely sure. The next day, Mark was quiet, distant. Alex could feel the change in the air, the coldness that had replaced their usual banter. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that Mark had found something. That afternoon, they received a call about a disturbance at an isolated farmhouse on the outskirts of the county. It was the kind of call that was usually a false alarm, a dispute between neighbors or a teenager's prank. As they drove down the long gravel driveway, a sense of dread washed over Alex. The farmhouse was abandoned, its windows boarded up, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin. It was the perfect place for an ambush or a conversation that no one else could ever hear. "Stay in the car," Alex said, his hand resting on his service weapon. "I'll check it out." "We go in together," Mark replied, his voice firm. "That's the protocol." They entered the house, their flashlights cutting through the dusty gloom. The air was thick with the smell of decay. As they moved from room to room, the silence stretched between them, taut and heavy with unspoken words. In the back bedroom, Mark stopped. He turned to face Alex, his expression a mixture of anger and betrayal. "I know, Alex," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I know who you are." He pulled the evidence bag from his pocket, the photograph inside a damning indictment. "Or should I say, Officer Thorne?" Alex's world shattered. The carefully constructed walls he had built around his past came crashing down. In that moment, he saw it all slipping away: his career, his family, his freedom. He saw the face of the informant he had helped cover up, the ghost that had haunted his every waking moment for 15 years. He saw a prison cell, the shame in his wife's eyes, the confusion on his children's faces. And in that moment of pure, unadulterated panic, the good man he had tried so hard to be was consumed by the monster he had tried so hard to escape. "You don't understand, Mark," Alex pleaded, his voice cracking. "I was young. I made a mistake." "A mistake?" Mark's voice rose, echoing in the empty house. "A man is dead, Alex. You covered it up. You lied to all of us." "I can explain," Alex said, taking a step forward. "Don't," Mark warned, his hand moving towards his own weapon. "It's over." But for Alex, it wasn't over. He couldn't let it be over. He saw only one way out, one terrible, irreversible path to preserving the life he had built on a foundation of lies. As Mark reached for his radio to call it in, Alex lunged. The struggle was brief and brutal, a desperate explosion of violence in the dusty silence of the abandoned house. It ended with a single, deafening gunshot. Mark Corrigan lay on the floor, his eyes wide with a final, uncomprehending shock. Alex stood over him, his chest heaving, the gun in his hand feeling impossibly heavy. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air, a stark contrast to the scent of decay. The silence that followed was more profound, more damning than any sound. He had done it. He had killed his partner, his friend. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. The weight of his secret had finally become too heavy to bear, and in his desperation to protect it, he had created a new, more monstrous one. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows through the grimy windows, Alex Thorne began the grim task of creating a new lie, one that would be built on the body of the only man who had discovered the truth. Chapter 2. The perfect lie. The immediate aftermath of the gunshot was a maelstrom of adrenaline and raw, animalistic panic. For a few heart-stopping moments, Alex was paralyzed, the reality of his actions washing over him in a sickening wave. The silence of the abandoned farmhouse was a living entity, pressing in on him, amplifying the frantic thumping of his own heart. He looked down at Mark, at the still, lifeless form of the man who had been his partner just minutes before, and a cold, calculating part of his brain took over, a part that had been dormant for 15 years. The part that knew how to survive. His training, both as a cop and as a man who knew how to cover his tracks, kicked in. He couldn't undo what he had done, but he could control what happened next. Every second was critical. He holstered his weapon and knelt beside Mark, his movements precise and methodical despite the tremor in his hands. He checked for a pulse he knew he wouldn't find. He then took out his radio, his voice a carefully constructed mask of distress and urgency. "Dispatch, this is 2 Adam 14, he choked out, forcing a sob into his throat. "Shots fired. I repeat, shots fired. Officer down. My partner's been hit. Send backup and an ambulance to the Old Miller farmhouse on County Road 12. Suspect fled on foot, heading west into the woods. White male, blue jacket, armed and dangerous. He had created a phantom, a ghost to take the blame. It was a classic, by-the-book scenario, one that every cop in the county would immediately understand and believe. He knew the woods behind the farmhouse were dense and sprawling, a perfect place for a suspect to disappear, ensuring a long and ultimately fruitless search that would buy him precious time. While he waited for the wail of sirens to break the rural silence, Alex went to work. He moved through the scene with a cold efficiency, his mind a checklist of procedures to follow and evidence to create. He took Mark's gun from its holster and fired a single shot into the decaying plaster of a nearby wall, the sound echoing the earlier fatal blast. He then placed the gun back in Mark's hand, curling his partner's stiffening fingers around the grip. It would look like Mark had returned fire, a hero until the very end. He ran outside to their patrol car and grabbed the spare throw-down pistol he kept hidden under the passenger seat, a relic from his past, an unregistered, untraceable weapon he had kept for emergencies. This, he thought with a grim irony, was the ultimate emergency. He went back inside and fired it once more, this time into the doorframe near where he had been standing. He then wiped it clean and tossed it deep into the overgrown brush behind the house. He scuffed the floorboards, overturned a rickety table, and kicked a chair across the room, creating the illusion of a violent struggle. He was no longer just a cop. He was a director, a choreographer of a tragedy in which he would star as the heroic, grieving survivor. When the first patrol cars arrived, tires skidding on the gravel driveway, they found Alex kneeling beside his fallen partner, his uniform stained with Mark's blood, his face a convincing portrait of anguish and shock. He gave his statement, a carefully rehearsed narrative of a routine call that had turned into a deadly ambush. He described the phantom suspect, providing just enough detail to be credible but not enough to be easily disproven. He was the sole witness, the only one who had seen the killer. His version of events would become the official record. The department was plunged into a state of shock and mourning. The murder of a police officer was the ultimate sin, an attack on the entire brotherhood. An immense manhunt was launched, with officers from 3 counties, K-9 units, and a state police helicopter combing the woods for the non-existent shooter. The Oak Haven community rallied around their grieving heroes, tying blue ribbons to trees and leaving flowers at the department headquarters. And at the center of it all was Alex, the tragic hero, accepting condolences from his fellow officers, his face a stoic mask of grief. He played his part to perfection, his every word and action designed to reinforce his innocence. But a lie, no matter how perfectly constructed, is a fragile thing. And the person assigned to test its integrity was Detective Isabella Rossi. Rossi was a detective with the state's Bureau of Criminal Investigation, a department that was often called in to handle sensitive cases, particularly those involving officer-involved shootings. She was in her late 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing and a reputation for being methodical, relentless, and immune to departmental politics. She was an outsider by design, and it gave her an objectivity that made many local cops uneasy. From the moment she arrived at the crime scene, Rossi felt a faint, indefinable sense of wrongness. The scene, as Alex had described it, was a chaotic mess of a life-or-death struggle. But to Rossi's trained eye, it felt staged. The overturned table seemed too perfectly placed, the scuff marks on the floor too deliberate. It was the kind of chaos you saw in a movie, not the messy, unpredictable reality of a real gunfight. She began her investigation by interviewing Alex. He sat across from her in a sterile interrogation room, his gaze steady, his answers crisp and consistent. He recounted the events of that afternoon with a heartbreaking clarity, his voice thick with emotion at all the right moments. He was a convincing witness, almost too convincing. Rossi had interviewed hundreds of trauma victims in her career. Their stories were almost always fragmented, confused, filled with gaps and inconsistencies as their minds struggled to process the horror they had endured. Alex's story, by contrast, was a perfect, linear narrative. It was clean, concise, and unwavering. It was the story of a man who had not just experienced a traumatic event, but had rehearsed it. "You said the suspect fired first?" Rossi asked, her tone conversational. "Yes," Alex replied, nodding. "He was hiding in the bedroom, jumped out as we came in, fired a shot that went wide. Mark returned fire and then he shot Mark." "You didn't fire your weapon?" "It all happened so fast," Alex said, shaking his head, his eyes welling up. "I was trying to get a clear shot, but the suspect was using Mark as a shield. By the time I had an opening, he was gone." It was a plausible explanation, but it didn't quite sit right with Rossi. Why wouldn't a highly decorated, experienced officer like Thorne fire his weapon in defense of his partner? It was a split-second decision, to be sure, but it was a deviation from standard training that pricked at the edges of her suspicion. Rossi's doubts solidified when the preliminary forensics report came back. The single bullet casing found at the scene that didn't match Mark's or Alex's service weapons, the one presumably from the killer's gun, was found in a spot that was inconsistent with Alex's description of the events. According to Alex, the shooter was in the doorway, but the casing was found in the far corner of the room, behind a fallen dresser. It was possible it had been kicked or had ricocheted, but it was another small detail that didn't quite fit the narrative. Rossi decided to dig into the case that Alex and Mark had been working on before the shooting, the pawn shop break-in. On the surface, it seemed like a dead end, just as Alex had insisted. But Rossi, like Mark, was not one to let a loose thread go unpulled. She drove to the pawn shop and spoke with Sal, the owner. Sal was even more nervous than he had been with the local cops, and under Rossi's calm but persistent questioning, his story began to crumble. He admitted that the safe had contained more than just paperwork. It held old ledgers, records from a time in his life he had tried to forget. He was vague about the details, but he mentioned old partners and bad blood. Working off this new information, Rossi subpoenaed Sal's phone records. She found a series of calls made in the days leading up to the break-in, all to a burner phone. But more interestingly, she found a single call made the day after Mark's murder. It was a short call, less than 30 seconds, made to a number that, after some digging, she traced back to a payphone in a town 3 states away, the same town where Alex had begun his career. While Rossi was quietly pulling at these threads, Alex was doing everything he could to control the investigation from the inside. As the department's hero and the victim's partner, he was given unprecedented access to the case files. He used this position to steer the manhunt in the wrong direction, feeding the search teams false tips and anonymous sightings of his phantom suspect that kept them chasing shadows. He subtly discredited Mark's earlier work on the pawn shop case, dismissing it as the obsessive-compulsive digging of a junior officer who couldn't see the forest for the trees. Mark was a good cop, but he had a tendency to get bogged down in details, Alex told the sheriff, his voice filled with a sad, brotherly affection. He was chasing a ghost with that pawn shop thing. The real killer is still out there. But the lie was beginning to take its toll. Alex was living on a knife's edge, constantly looking over his shoulder, his every interaction a performance. The guilt was a physical presence, a constant pressure in his chest that made it hard to breathe. He couldn't sleep, and when he did, his dreams were filled with the image of Mark's surprised, accusing eyes. His wife noticed his distance, his short temper, his haunted expression, but she attributed it to the trauma of losing his partner. The department saw a hero struggling with grief, not a murderer buckling under the weight of his own deception. The turning point came when Rossi decided to take a closer look at Deputy Mark Corrigan's life. She visited his apartment, a small, meticulously neat space that spoke volumes about the man who had lived there. And on his desk, next to his personal laptop, she found a small, spiral-bound notebook. It was Mark's personal case journal, a place where he jotted down his thoughts and theories, things he didn't include in his official reports. As Rossi flipped through the pages, she saw Mark's growing obsession with the pawn shop case. He had detailed his suspicions about Sal, his frustration with Alex's resistance, and his late-night research into cold cases. And then, on the very last page, written in a hurried, almost frantic script, were two words that made Rossi's blood run cold. They were the last words Mark Corrigan had ever written. Thorne. He's lying. Chapter 3. The cracks in the facade, the two words in Mark Corrigan's notebook, Thorne. He's lying. Transformed Detective Rossi's quiet suspicion into a full-blown, albeit secret, investigation. It was a ghost's accusation, a voice from the grave, and it was more powerful than any piece of forensic evidence she had found so far. She now had a motive, or at least the seed of one. Mark had discovered something about Alex, something he was willing to lie about, and Mark had ended up dead. The connection was too direct, too damning to be a coincidence. Rossi knew she had to proceed with extreme caution. Alex Thorne was not just a decorated deputy. He was a beloved figure in the department, a symbol of everything they stood for. To openly accuse him of murdering his partner without irrefutable proof would be career suicide. It would be seen as an attack on a grieving hero, a desperate move by an outsider trying to close a high-profile case. She had to build her case in the shadows, piece by piece, until it was so solid, so undeniable, that even Alex's most loyal supporters would have to see the truth. Her first step was to understand the lie. What had Mark discovered? The notebook pointed her back to the pawn shop and the cold cases Mark had been researching. Rossi spent days poring over old files, chasing down the same faint trail Mark had been following. She cross-referenced Sal's known associates with criminal databases from Alex's former city, and slowly, a picture began to emerge. It was a picture of a close-knit, highly effective, and notoriously brutal anti-gang unit from 15 years ago. A unit that had been dogged by rumors of corruption but had always managed to evade any official investigation. And as she dug deeper into the unit's history, she found the name she was looking for. Officer Marcus Thorne, the unit's celebrated leader, and his younger brother, a promising rookie named Alex. With this connection established, Rossi focused on the unit's most controversial case, the shooting of an unarmed informant. The official report was a textbook example of a justified shooting. The informant had pulled a gun. The officers had fired in self-defense. But Rossi found the original case files, buried deep in a dusty archive, and discovered that the lead investigator had raised serious doubts about the authenticity of the scene. He had suspected the informant's gun was a plant, but he had been pressured by his superiors to close the case. The investigator had since retired, but Rossi tracked him down. The old detective, now a bitter man living a quiet life in the suburbs, confirmed her suspicions. That whole unit was dirty, he told her over the phone, his voice thick with resentment. And the Thornes were at the heart of it. They ran that department like their own private kingdom. While Rossi was unearthing the ghosts of Alex's past, Alex himself was beginning to feel the immense pressure of maintaining his lie. The initial outpouring of sympathy from the department had started to fade, replaced by the grim reality of an unsolved cop killing. The manhunt for his phantom suspect had yielded nothing, and the case was growing cold. The constant performance was exhausting him, chipping away at his nerves. He felt Rossi's presence like a shadow at his back, her quiet, persistent questions a constant threat. He knew she was digging, and he knew it was only a matter of time before she found something. His paranoia began to manifest in small but significant ways. He became short-tempered with his family, his mind always elsewhere. At work, he was obsessed with the Corrigan case file, constantly checking to see who had accessed it, what new reports had been added. He used his authority to try and block Rossi's requests for information, claiming they were irrelevant to the search for Mark's killer. But his attempts at obstruction only served to strengthen Rossi's resolve. She started to bypass the local department altogether, using her state-level authority to access records and files that Alex couldn't control. The cat-and-mouse game between them escalated. Rossi knew Alex was watching her, so she started to feed him misinformation, letting him see her pursue false leads to make him believe she was on the wrong track. Meanwhile, she was quietly building her real case against him. She managed to get a warrant to search Mark Corrigan's personal laptop. On it, she found his search history from the night he died. He had been searching for Alex Thorne, Marcus Thorne, and the name of the dead informant from 15 years ago. And she found one more thing, a saved low-resolution image file. It was the grainy newspaper photograph of the anti-gang unit the one Mark had printed out. He had circled Alex's face with a digital red marker. This was the smoking gun Rossi needed. Proved that Mark knew Alex's secret. It was the motive for the murder. Now all she needed was to break Alex's perfect alibi. She decided it was time for a direct confrontation, a calculated risk designed to shake him, to make him make a mistake. She requested a formal interview with Alex, not in the familiar comfort of the Oakhaven department, but in a neutral interrogation room at the state police barracks an hour away. The change of venue was a psychological tactic, designed to strip him of his home field advantage. Alex, knowing that refusing the interview would look suspicious, agreed. The room was small, cold, and gray. A single table and 3 chairs were the only furniture. Rossi sat across from Alex, a thick file on the table between them. She began by going over the same ground they had covered before, asking him to recount the events of the shooting one more time. Alex, ever the professional, delivered his well-rehearsed story with practiced emotion. When he was finished, Rossi leaned forward, her gaze intense. "That's a very compelling story, Deputy," she said, her voice quiet but sharp. "The problem is, I don't believe a word of it." She opened the file and slid a photograph across the table. It was the picture of the anti-gang unit. "Recognize anyone in this photo, Officer Thorne?" she asked, deliberately using his old name. Alex's carefully constructed composure finally shattered. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of pure, unadulterated panic flashed in his eyes before he could suppress it. He stared at the photograph, his face pale. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice a low growl. "I think you do," Rossi pressed, her voice relentless. "I know about your brother, Marcus. I know about the informant. And I know that Mark Corrigan knew about it too. He found this picture, didn't he, Alex? He confronted you with it, and you killed him to keep him quiet." Alex stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This interview is over," he snarled. "I'm not going to sit here and listen to these insane accusations." "Sit down, Deputy," Rossi commanded, her voice like steel. "We're not done yet." But Alex was already at the door, his hand on the knob. He was trapped, cornered, and his survival instincts were screaming at him to run. He stormed out of the room, leaving Rossi alone with the photograph that had sealed his fate. The confrontation had worked better than Rossi could have hoped. She had cracked the facade, rattled the unshakable hero. She knew Alex would be desperate now, and desperate men make mistakes. She put a tail on him, a discreet surveillance team to track his every move. Alex drove back to Oakhaven in a blind panic. Rossi knew. She knew everything. It was over. He had to disappear. He went home and started packing a bag, his movements frantic. He grabbed cash, a fake ID he had kept from his old life, and the keys to a beat-up truck he kept registered under a false name. But as he was about to leave, he looked at a photograph on his mantelpiece, a picture of his wife and kids, smiling, happy, blissfully unaware of the monster he had become. He couldn't just leave them. He had to protect them. A new, more desperate plan formed in his mind. He couldn't outrun Rossi, but maybe he could stop her. He had to discredit her, destroy her credibility, and make her investigation go away. He still had allies in the department, people who trusted him, who would believe his word over that of an outsider detective. He began to make a series of calls, planting seeds of doubt about Rossi's methods, suggesting she was on a witch hunt, that she was trying to frame him to close the case. He hinted that she was unstable, obsessed, willing to do anything to get a conviction. His plan culminated in a bold and dangerous move. He knew Rossi kept all her case files on a secure, password-protected laptop. He used his knowledge of the department's IT systems to stage a burglary of Rossi's motel room while she was out. He didn't steal anything of value. He only took the laptop. He then dumped it in a nearby river, making it look like a random theft. His goal was simple: to destroy her evidence and make it seem like she was so careless and incompetent that her entire investigation was compromised. It was a reckless gamble, the act of a man with nothing left to lose. He was no longer just covering up a murder. He was actively waging a war against the investigation, using the very system he had sworn to uphold as a weapon. The cracks in his facade had become a chasm, and he had just leaped across it with no idea if he would make it to the other side. Chapter 4. The ticking clock. The theft of Detective Rossi's laptop sent shockwaves through the investigation. For Alex, it was a desperate, last-ditch effort to save himself. For Rossi, it was a declaration of war. She knew instantly that it wasn't a random burglary. The thief had ignored her wallet, her backup weapon, and other valuables, taking only the one thing that could destroy her case: the laptop containing every piece of evidence she had gathered against Alex Thorne. It was a professional, targeted hit, and she knew exactly who was behind it. Alex's gamble, however, had the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of discrediting Rossi, it made her superiors at the Bureau of Criminal Investigation sit up and take notice. The blatant attempt to sabotage a state-level investigation into a cop killing was an unprecedented act of aggression. They realized that Rossi wasn't on a witch hunt. She was onto something big, something someone was willing to go to extreme lengths to conceal. They gave her their full backing, providing her with a new team and expanded resources. The investigation, which had been a quiet, one-woman operation, was now a top-priority task force. But Rossi had a bigger problem. The original evidence, the digital photo from Mark's laptop, her interview notes, the retired detective's testimony, was all gone. She had backups of some files on a secure server, but the chain of custody for the most crucial evidence had been broken. She had to rebuild her case, and she had to do it quickly. The clock was ticking. Her greatest asset, she realized, was Alex's own paranoia. He had overplayed his hand. By targeting her directly, he had revealed his desperation. She decided to use that desperation against him. She let a rumor leak through a trusted contact in the Oakhaven department, a rumor that she had a secret informant, a cop on the inside who had been feeding her information all along. It was a complete fabrication, a bluff designed to make Alex look at his own colleagues with suspicion, to isolate him and to hopefully flush him out. The bluff worked perfectly. Alex, already on edge, became consumed with finding the supposed traitor in his midst. He saw suspicion in every glance, a potential betrayal in every whispered conversation. His relationships with his fellow officers, already strained by his increasingly erratic behavior, began to crumble. The hero of the department was now a paranoid, isolated man, and his colleagues started to see the cracks they had previously ignored. It was during this time that Rossi found her real-life, unlikely ally. A young, tech-savvy deputy named Miller, who had been in charge of the department's evidence room, had always looked up to Mark Corrigan. He had admired Mark's integrity and his meticulous approach to police work. Miller had been bothered by inconsistencies in the Corrigan case from the beginning, particularly some irregularities he had noticed in the evidence logs that Alex had signed off on. He had kept his doubts to himself, afraid to question a superior officer like Thorne. But as he watched Alex's behavior spiral, his suspicions grew. He approached Rossi in secret, offering his help. Miller was a digital native, a whiz with computers and data recovery. He told Rossi that Mark Corrigan had been meticulous about backing up his files to a personal, encrypted cloud server. It was a long shot, but if he could get access to it, he might be able to recover the files from Mark's laptop, including the damning photograph. Working together in secret, Rossi and Miller managed to get a warrant for Mark's cloud data. After hours of work, Miller broke through the encryption. And there it was, a complete, time-stamped backup of Mark's entire hard drive from the hour before he was killed. They had it all back: the search history, the newspaper article, and the photo of Alex with his brother's corrupt unit. They had their evidence. Armed with this new, undeniable proof, Rossi knew it was time to end the game. She obtained a warrant for Alex Thorne's arrest. But as her team moved into his house, they found it empty. He was gone. A neighbor reported seeing Alex's truck speeding away just an hour earlier. He had been tipped off. The traitor he had been so desperately searching for was real after a loyalist who had called to warn him that the state police were coming. A frantic manhunt ensued. Alex was no longer just a suspect. He was a fugitive, a trained and dangerous cop on the run. He knew their tactics, their procedures, their communication channels. He was a ghost in the system, always one step ahead. Rossi, however, had one last card to play. She knew Alex wasn't just running. He was running to something or someone. She went back to the beginning, to the pawn shop and the calls Sal had made to the payphone in Alex's old hometown. She believed that Alex's brother, Marcus, the man at the center of the original cover-up, was involved. She sent a team to watch Marcus Thorne. For 2 days, there was nothing. Then, on the third night, a beat-up truck matching the description of Alex's pulled into the driveway of a remote, isolated cabin owned by Marcus. The task force moved in. The final confrontation was not a blaze of glory or a hail of gunfire. It was quiet, tense, and tragic. They found Alex sitting at a wooden table in the dimly lit cabin, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. His brother, Marcus, stood in the corner, his expression a mixture of defiance and resignation. The hero of Oakhaven looked like a broken man. He didn't resist. He put his hands on the table and waited. In the interrogation room, under the harsh glare of the fluorescent lights, the full confession poured out of him. He told them everything: the cover-up 15 years ago, the chance encounter at the pawn shop, Mark's relentless investigation, and the final, fatal confrontation at the abandoned farmhouse. He spoke in a flat, emotionless voice, the voice of a man who had been running for so long that he was simply too tired to run anymore. He confessed not just to the murder of Mark Corrigan, but to the weight of the secret he had carried for 15 years, a weight that had finally crushed him. The news of Alex Thorne's arrest and confession devastated the Oakhaven Sheriff's Department. The betrayal cut deeper than any bullet. The man they had hailed as a hero was a murderer, his entire career a carefully constructed lie. The case left a permanent scar on the community, a painful reminder that the line between good and evil, between hero and villain, is often terrifyingly thin. Months later, after Alex Thorne had been tried, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison, Detective Rossi stood before a new class of police cadets. She looked out at their young, eager faces, filled with the same idealism that Mark Corrigan once had. "A badge is not a shield," she told them, her voice steady and clear. "It's a mirror. It reflects not only the community you serve, but who you are as a person. Carries the weight of public trust. Some will tell you that there is a thin blue line that separates us from them. But the most important line, the one you must never cross, is the one that separates right from wrong. Because once you cross that line, there is often no coming back." As she finished her speech, she thought of Mark Corrigan, the good cop who had died for the truth, and Alex Thorne, the fallen hero who had died long before he ever pulled the trigger. The case was closed, but for Rossi, the work was never truly over. The door to the office would always hold secrets, and it was her job to be the one who was willing to open it.